All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Center for Global Development. Thanks for being here. My name is Justin Sandifer. I am a senior fellow here at CGD, and we are really excited to be here for a discussion of the World Bank's report on education in East Asia and the Pacific, Growing Smarter. So let me give you just 60 seconds of introduction here, and then we're going to try to hand over quickly to the World Bank team to lead you into the core content. As somebody who works on education mostly in lots of other regions and in development generally, there's sort of this mantra in development economics of getting to Denmark. We want our economies and our institutions to kind of look like the Danish system. But in education circles, it's really a lot more about getting to Vietnam, right? Vietnam has managed, if you look at international learning assessments, to outperform the United States in absolute terms with less than 10% of American GDP. So on lots of education fronts, it's not the Scandinavians that we look to as examples. If you work in development, it's some of the East Asian countries that we're going to be talking about today. Now, I think there are two kind of distinct sets of concerns that motivate both the report and probably many of us in the audience here. One of those is, the World Bank lends money to East Asian countries, some of which are already performing very well on many education indicators, but are eager to do better. And so the World Bank provides money and advice to those economies. But also there is this question back to the getting to Vietnam of can we bottle that up and export that? What did Japan, South Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore do, and can that be replicated elsewhere? Those are very different questions, but I think at the core of both of them is sort of a causal inference problem of education policy. What was it that works? Can it be improved within East Asian countries? Can it be taken elsewhere? So I'm hoping that's it's like the wealth and poverty of nations for the education sector that Harry has to lead us through here today. But without further ado, we're going to do a short video that kind of introduces the general themes of the Growing Smarter report. And then immediately after the video, I'm going to hand over directly to Harry Petrinos, who is the manager for education for East Asia and the Pacific at the bank, who is going to give you a presentation of the report. All right. So if Saul's in back.
Good morning, and thank you very much. Thanks for the introduction, Justin, and it's an honor to be here. It's an honor to be in a room, conference room named after Nancy Birdsall, and to be at an event with Nancy Birdsall, who has done a lot for development and very important to the development community. Let me give a very brief presentation on this flagship report, very important report, I think, for for education, for East Asia, and for the development community. As many of you know, since 1960, economies in the East Asian Pacific region have had faster economic growth and greater human capital accumulation than any other region. So it's apt that we would study this region in terms of educational lessons, educational priorities, and some of the challenges in the region. The East Asian Pacific economies grew by more than 7% a year between 1961 and 2015. This is more than double the world average economic growth rate during the same period of time. This produced an economy in East Asia Pacific, including China, of worth more than $11 trillion. If the region had grown at the world economic growth rates, it would be worth only $1.5 trillion. And not to think that it's only because of China. Even without China, the region would have grown at almost $5 trillion. And with China, of course, the growth has been at this historic level. The economy has evolved over time. It used to be a lot of agriculture, a lot of small-scale agriculture, a lot of low productivity work. That's changed over time with the growth in services and manufacturing throughout the region. So a significant shift. This region, East Asian Pacific, includes 29 countries and economies, 26% of the world's school-aged children, 20 million public school teachers, and according to the OECD, 7 of the top 10 education systems are in the East Asia region. Yet we also highlight some of the challenges. There are people in countries or regions or parts of countries where the learning levels are not sufficient or that we don't have accurate measurements of learning outcomes. So the learning crisis also exists in East Asia and the Pacific. Some of the stellar performance of East Asia can be seen in human capital accumulation in terms of years of schooling. In 1950, the average years of schooling in the region was just 1 year, compared to almost 3 years in the rest of the world. But East Asia caught up very quickly over the decades and has reached the world average levels and continues to grow. We know that a year of schooling is productive in terms of earnings. Every year of schooling increases earnings by about 10%. East Asia is no different. Interesting fact from Vietnam, the growth in the supply of educated labor has been able to keep up with the demand, and this is expressed in terms of the wage growth. We've had a 94% growth of the workforce with tertiary level education, but wage premiums to tertiary education have increased by a factor much larger than that. So the demand for skills continues to grow as the systems develop. We have a human capital learning outcome database that tries to scale learning outcomes across the world. And we can see the huge gap between the top performers in East Asia and low-income countries. Huge differences in learning outcomes. In the East Asia region, we've grouped countries according to their performance on these international assessments, and you can see the high-performing and higher-income countries to the right, well above the OECD averages, and even for some of the middle-income countries in the middle, still above OECD average levels, and Vietnam punching significantly above of their weight, reaching levels that are as high as some high-income OECD countries. There are countries that are facing a challenge at lower levels of learning outcomes. Thailand, Malaysia would be in that category, and other countries that are struggling. The other point about this graphic is the countries that are not represented because they don't participate in international or regional assessments, and we know from other assessments the learning challenge in those countries. But it is a region with some very high performers, and the report tries to distill the lessons of success and what can be applied elsewhere. Another indicator of the success of the system is the countries that are achieving levels of education much higher than what would be predicted by their characteristics. Vietnam stands out considerably. more than 4 years more schooling than what predicted by any comparison, but the other high-performing countries are also above their levels. Struggling countries are slightly below where they would be predicted. The other fact about East Asia high performers are not only are the scores high, but the dispersion in scores tends to be less than other parts of the world. So equity is also high in high-performing East Asian countries. Yet, while 40% of the region's population are in high-performing, above-average education systems, we estimate that 60% of students are in countries where there is a learning challenge, low levels of learning, or for which we have no information yet on learning outcomes. So learning crisis, again, is apparent even in East Asia region. But what can we learn from the success of the East Asia region that can be applied elsewhere? The flagship team has put together this framework to distill the success of the region in 5 main policy domains: aligning institutions, concentrating spending, assessing students, preparing students for school, and maybe the most important factor, selecting and supporting teachers to create the conditions in the classroom for learning. So the first policy area, aligning institutions to make sure the conditions for learning take place. This has to do with setting the right policies, implementing the right policies, and taking a system-wide, coherent, aligned approach. One indicator of the success of this approach in East Asia, this graphic on the proportion of children or people in the population with no schooling. So if we look at 1950, many countries in the region had significant proportion of the population with no schooling. But by 2010, for most countries, this becomes an insignificant number. So the commitment to reform, commitment to building the system is clear in the high-performing East Asia countries. The second area has to do with public spending. One of the success factors of the high-performing countries is their focus on basic education first and a sequential development of the education systems. In the Education Commission report, I think they referred to this progressive universalism. Korea exemplifies this, but many other high-performing countries have followed this path. The focus on basic skills continues even in the high-income countries. Here we compare Japan and Indonesia on the share of spending that goes to elementary education vis-a-vis tertiary education. And you can see that in Japan, while the proportion going to higher education has increased over time, the proportion to elementary has decreased, still relatively more spent on elementary education. Not the same can be said for Indonesia, which tends, according to this comparison, to overspend on higher levels of schooling without first securing the performance of the basic education system. The third area on teachers, selecting the best to go into teaching and then supporting them through their career with training, with incentives, with pay that is commensurate with performance. Several examples could be cited from East Asia, from the high-performing countries where only a fraction of applicants to education programs are accepted, and even a fraction of those are able to find their way to a classroom. Korea, 1 in 20 are able to pass the exam to get into teaching. In Singapore, only the top third of university graduates can become teachers. And as well from other parts of East Asia. The focus on selecting the best, making it a very prestigious occupation, and then supporting teachers to deliver high-quality learning. Not many other countries are performing at this level, but these are the policies on the teacher side, among the policies that account for the success of the East Asian countries, high-performing countries. The report also busts some myths about East Asia. One of the perhaps anecdotes about East Asia is that a lot of it has to do with memorization and rote learning. Turns out, according to the OECD, there's much less memorization in East Asia than other parts of the world. There's, in fact, much more elaboration in the teaching methods, and this explains the success. The other myth, perhaps, that's busted in the report is on the cultural preference for schooling. Might be high in East Asia, but what really accounts for success is the policies and the implementation, serious implementation, alignment of those policies throughout the system. The fourth area is on preparation of children for schooling, ECD, early childhood development, early childhood education, and we do have evidence that in the high performers, there is a focus on preparing children for school. Here we break the support for preparedness in terms of supported pregnancy, birth, family support, child health and development, and preschool. And you can see from the case of Korea, high-performing country, there is a high level of support in all 5 areas. But in other countries that are still struggling to catch up, there is good support for mothers at pregnancy and increasing support to preschools, but a lot of gaps in between the years between birth and preschool. And these gaps need to be addressed in order to support early preparedness for schooling. The 5th policy area is on assessment. The region uses assessments to inform policy, to target resources, and to make sure that spending is benefiting learning in the classroom. We could use many examples. Here we look at the early grade reading assessments. These are quite popular throughout the East Asia Pacific region. These have been used to identify learning challenges and to target resources and effort on improving learning outcomes. Even in some relatively high-performing countries, there is a proportion of the population that's unable to read at 2nd grade. Let's focus on the case of Cambodia. In 2010, an early grade reading assessment identified that 48% of 2nd grade students were unable to read a single word. With concentrated action by government, donor partners, and others, this was reduced to only 33% in just 2 years. So dramatic decrease in the proportion of children who can't read. Cambodia went on to develop a national assessment system and now will join PISA for Development in the next round. So early reading assessments and assessment in general have been used to inform policy and to target resources and effort. So the 5 policy areas that the report highlights again are aligning institutions. You can think of this as coherence and system-wide attention to reforms, concentrating spending on basic education and concentrating spending on equalizing opportunities for all children to benefit from schooling. Perhaps the most important is on the teacher policy. High-performing countries are very selective about who gets into teaching and who gets into the classroom, and then support them throughout their career. Early education, preparing children from birth, before birth, up to preschool and ensuring that they are learning. And I would add to that in the early years, attention to early grade reading, which is on the rise in many East Asia Pacific countries, and the use of assessment to diagnose issues and to inform policy and spending and making sure that these work. All of this works together, not one policy on its own, and the coherence, I would say, is very important along with the teachers. Many other important aspects of the East Asia success are documented in the report, along with the challenges in many countries, and I recommend you to that report. I want to thank the team, most of which are here, Michael, Amr, and Raja, who led the effort, and thank you for your attention.
We have a slightly back and forth running order here because we're going to have a panel come up and do some more general discussion. But if there is, we wanted to do an interruption to say if there's quick questions, clarifying questions, anything you want to not let Harry slip away on and pin him down on quickly, now is your chance. Otherwise, you will have another shot at Harry. Yes, please.
Thank you. Very interesting presentation. Just one quick question, because we talked about more on the success part, but sometimes people learn more from other people's failure. So I was just wondering if you could highlight some of the lessons and experience that you have observed from looking at cross-East Asian countries in particular about, for example, the disalignment or inequity amongst education access and access to quality education, but also in terms of preparedness for school, especially with national state budgets on even earlier years. I'm actually done, but do I need to? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much for the question. Yes, I agree. We can also learn a lot from what doesn't work. And I think in many aspects, the report has mirror images of the success stories. And one of them has to do with curriculum. In the high-performing countries, curriculum reform has been very consistent, has been aligned with the reforms in the general system. Korea going back to post-war times, and more recently the Japanese reforms to align curriculum to the needs of the modern workforce. In other countries, we see attempts to roll out curriculum that are not well prepared and then rolled back. Indonesia is one of the examples given in that regard. The other has to do with public spending. There are countries that are spending a lot on education in the region, but not spending it very well. And that again goes to alignment and system-wide efforts. The case of Vietnam is a good one. Teacher pay is much lower than the case of Thailand, but teacher performance much higher in Vietnam, partly because of the focus on selecting better graduates for the teaching profession, but also in terms of where the resources go and how teachers are supported throughout their careers. So yes, there are several examples of misalignments in that.
One more before we bring the rest of the panel up.
Thanks, Harry. Thanks for all your great work in this area. I'm just wondering, with this analysis and the information from the recent World Development Report, how do you think the findings and the framework that you developed can be used to help the bank and other organizations, I'm with USAID, shape our lending and programming practices? And most importantly, how do you think the framework and the analyses are being received and used by the partner countries that we work with to focus on some of the, particularly some of the institutional and policy constraints that they're facing in some of the high-performing countries in East Asia that are still performing well economically but lagging behind on the education indicators?
Right. Thank you very much. So I think the World Development Report highlights at a global scale just what is the learning crisis, and one of the takeaways there is that we need to measure this. We need to know exactly where countries are and where exactly the learning challenge takes place in order to design the programs. The East Asia report allows us in East Asian Pacific to really focus on this. We didn't talk a lot about the Pacific, but there's a considerable lag in the Pacific in terms of access to schooling, but especially on learning outcomes. And I think this report allows us to look not only at the high performers, but also the countries that are emerging, like Cambodia, which does have still a significant learning challenge, but has decided to focus on those fundamentals as they develop their economy, as they develop their programs. And I think already we're seeing, in the case of Cambodia, a government that's looking at the report, looking at other things as well, in order to reevaluate its program going forward. In our dissemination last month in Cambodia, we had follow-up meetings where government told us that they're looking at this to identify where they're doing well and where they can continue to improve. This report, I think, nicely puts together the economic growth story along with human capital. And as Justin mentioned earlier, this is really the focus going forward on how do we align education policy with economic growth strategies. I think that's where we're hoping to apply this in the East Asia Pacific region. Thank you.
All right. I want to invite then the rest of our panel. Thank you, Harry. To come on up to the stage. And I'm going to start off with a round of kind of fairly broad softball questions for each of the panelists, and I'll introduce them as I go, and then we'll get progressively more difficult maybe as we as we go. But like I said, I'll start off general and introduce you as you go. So starting in the middle, Jaime Saavedra is the director for the Education Global Practice at the World Bank. So responsibility within East Asia and beyond East Asia, kind of for education at the bank globally. So I kind of want to ask you, Jaime, the two parts that I opened with, which is kind of the inward-facing lessons for the region and the outward-facing lessons that you take away for the rest of the world that you're responsible for. Maybe let's start with the latter. There's a lot in the report. You have responsibility for programs in Africa, in South Asia, and so on. Do you just have to be Vietnam to get to Vietnam, or what do you take away from these high-performing education systems for your work in other regions?
That's not an easy question. And I was hoping, that was the male in the among the commentators that was going to be ladies first. Didn't work. So look, I think there are many lessons, although I always want to say that we shouldn't talk about best practices. We should talk always about practices that we see everywhere in the world, and then go when we're talking about one specific country, then look at those practices that are out there and see what makes sense for this country, right? However, there are some things that make sense, right? And one, if you want to ask me about the first one regarding what we have seen in East Asia, is what's the way they have worked with teachers. I mean, there are many things that have to happen, right, in order to improve quality of education, in order to be sure that the educational system is focused not only on access, but it's also focused on learning. There are many things that are needed, but if there's one thing that is critical, it's teachers, is what's the focus of the teacher's career. So, and I think there are many East Asian countries that have done the right thing in terms of making sure they have a system in which they recruit the best people, right? They give them, they put a filter in such a way that it's not that you just walk into the university or to the educational pedagogical institute, but there is a filter in order to enter there. Then there's another filter to enter the career. And given that you have passed those filters, in addition to that, then you have the right professional development opportunities within the system. In such a way that teachers understand that their terms of reference are not to teach. They're not there to teach. They are there to make sure that all the students in that classroom are learning, right? Which is slightly different, right? Because it could be, if my terms of reference is to teach, well, I teach. If you learn, great. If you don't, that's your problem, right? But I was told to teach, right? And I think the way careers are structured in many of these in the East Asian countries are such that there is an internalization of teachers that's their role, and that it is a critical role. So when Harry was saying we need to focus on the classroom, actually, I would say it even stronger. It's a focus, right, on a teacher that understands that his or her role is to make sure that all the students, and I emphasize all the students that are heterogeneous, that are different, that will have different backgrounds, that will have different starting points, that will have different preferences. They are all different. Okay, that implies that's a very tough job for the teacher, right? So that I think that is critical. And the other part is critical is the type of support that those teachers get, right? Middle-income countries and low-income countries spend hundreds of millions of dollars in teachers' training, right? And most of that teachers' training is just money going down the drain, right? You go 2 weeks somewhere, usually to the capital of the province or the capital of the country, you are trained 2 weeks, then you go back to your classroom and do exactly the same that you were doing before, right? So what we have been learning is that the most effective training, right, is the one that is linked to the school, and is the one that requires a school that is working well. And for a school that is working well, you need a principal, right, that has that understand that his or her role, right, in the school is to manage that complex institution, but to manage those human resources, right? So it's not easy to say, okay, let's focus all the way we provide training and make it school-centered, right, or school-managed, right? Yeah, that's the way of doing it. But for that to happen, then you need a school that works. And for a school that works, then you need to have a principal that can be in charge of that. So if I summarize, then it's the human factor, right? The human factor is absolutely critical, right? Make sure that you select the right teachers and make sure that you select the right principals, right, in order to have a working school. I could continue, but maybe I leave it there at this stage.
Okay,
There are other good lessons, but let me leave it there.
But I like prioritization, so it's
Yeah.
good. You gave us one core lesson. I've got more follow-up questions for you, but let me go and move next to you to Nancy. So Nancy Birdsall is the founding president here at the Center for Global Development, the person that hired me, so I have to be nicer with the questions to Nancy. But 25 years ago, I looked it up.
Only.
I looked it up, Nancy. It was 25 years ago that you co-authored the Asian Miracle Report at the World Bank about the growth miracle and some of the same economies that we're talking about here. Do you think that the educational success is entirely endogenous to and a consequence of the growth, or is it the other way around? Any reflections on that, past, experience, and just generally your reaction to what you've heard both from Harry and from Jaime here and looking at this report?
Okay, well, that's a big question for me too. Let me say first a couple of things I really liked about the report with Africa's challenge in my head. And first, there's a lot of emphasis. There's emphasis on early childhood testing. So you heard about that. So children don't end up in what Lant Pritchett calls a situation of butts in seats. That is, lots of enrollment without learning. Second, I like very much the discussion of assessment and the discussion that follows, avoid high stakes testing. Assessment is meant to inform, diagnose and inform. So it's meant to help the system, right? And third, there's this emphasis on preschool. I was kind of sorry to see that preschool is not often in countries that are performing poorly accompanied by other early childhood investments. But to go to Justin's question, I asked myself, actually, why these high-performing countries in East Asia, including Vietnam. And I thought I'd set out 3 quick answers, which I'm not sure they go to the heart of what to do about education systems, except, well, I'll try to say something. So why? Why are these systems in East Asia, in high-performing countries, to use the language of the report, aligned and coherent and incentive-based, I guess? So first, I think there's a political logic for post-World War II. There was, for countries like Taiwan, at that time, I don't know if I should call it a country in a World Bank session, but for economies like Taiwan, Korea, Hong Kong, there was the very big shadow of communist China. And there was, therefore, a political logic around going for growth, A, and B, ensuring that people were co-opted to their own governments and not co-opted by the communists. There was still that nervousness. And notice that this is also true for Vietnam in an interesting way, post, 1972 or whatever. So that's one thing. That political logic was linked to the growth impulse, and the growth impulse was linked to we've got to have human resources because we don't have natural resources. And we've got to be able to compete in the global economy in order to grow. It helped that war in the case of some countries, the effects of war is to level the playing field. And I come to my second point, which is a relatively equal distribution of assets. One thing that war does is it undermines, it creates a level playing field because the elite lose relatively more. So you can have a sort of start over, a little bit like those of you who know education in El Salvador. The famous program that worked well after El Salvador had been at war for a long time, a civil war. So second is distribution, and third was a flexible labor market policy. And I don't want to go into that too much, but it was tied to the idea that you want to create demand for education. And a flexible labor market policy allows, the supply side, those who are demanding labor on the production side, to, avoid the costs of hiring and firing that's regulated. This is a big comparison to Latin America that Jaime will be familiar with. So there's a sense in which I think, what's the conclusion from this is not very straightforward for other places, for even Latin America today, and certainly for African systems, except to the extent that you want the education minister at the cabinet table, particularly on progressive universalism, to use the language that Harry used. You want to work hard to be inclusive when you're doing your growth agenda, because you want to somehow find ways in whatever setting you're in to be more the way these countries in East Asia were post-World War II. So there were other factors as well, but the whole business is what Harry referred to at the beginning, kind of a virtuous cycle of the growth impulse tied to educational progress, that it's a virtuous circle going around. So let me stop there. I think that's good enough for now, I hope.
Communism, war, and a flexible labor
Yes.
market.
Yeah.
We have an easy set of policy prescriptions
Right.
here.
Well, but the distribution issue, I think, how to translate that into today's world for many countries.
Wouldn't use war as a policy prescription.
Yeah,
You cannot use war.
Let's not get that on the record here at the World Bank event. Right? Okay, let me come over here to Agustina. So Agustina Pagulayan is our postdoc here at the Center for Global Development, soon to be assistant professor at UC San Diego. She a former World Banker and, unlike most of us here at the center, a political scientist. So I want to ask Agustina more of a political sciencey question with a little bit of a lead-in here. One thing that you often get at the end of research papers and reports is, these are interesting questions and more research is needed to find out what works. Refreshingly, there is a section in this report which says we have tested and proven solutions for early grade reading and learning. We know how to teach kids to read. We know how to do some things in early childhood development. Here's a list of programs that have worked. And so that resonated with some things I've heard you say and seen you write, which is, okay, if we know technically what the solutions are, then why aren't we doing them, right? And you can either provide me an answer to that question, that would be great, or you can tell me that that's the wrong question and you reject the premise, or that the World Bank is asking the wrong questions. I'm just curious to hear you reflect as a political scientist on what you saw about the politics of reform in this report.
Okay, thanks. And I'm going to answer a little bit your question going back to what Jaime was pointing at the beginning about the importance of teachers and the selectivity of the teaching profession and how that has been so important for the East Asian countries' high performance. One of the things that the report doesn't mention is that most of these high-performing countries are not democratic, or if they are democratic today, they developed their policies and have a legacy of policies that were developed under autocratic regimes. And the politics of policy making under an autocratic regime is completely different from the politics of policy making in a democratic regime. Because first, you don't have so many players or political actors with whom you can have to come to agreement. In a democratic regime, you not only have parties in a Congress that are competing with one another and debating, and there's also these different checks and balances between the legislature and the executive and so on. You also have typically freedom of association, which means that teachers can organize and protest against reforms. And so you have to negotiate not just sort of like with the legislature and the executive and so on, but also with the people who are implementing. In an autocratic regime, you can threaten to use repression if teachers decide to go against any attempt to make the teaching profession harder to get into. And so my concern about looking at the report is that, yes, I agree that East Asian countries are performing well for the reasons that the report claims, including the selectivity of the teaching profession. Can other countries that are democratic actually go there? I think that's a much tougher question, and it's definitely not straightforward. And if you look at how countries in a bunch of democratic countries have looked at teaching, even if you go to the Argentine Ministry of Education's website, maybe they've taken it down now, but one of the things that they said is like the teaching career is a form of social mobility. It's not just that education is a form of social mobility, but teaching itself, access to teaching jobs is a form of social mobility. And that's on their website, and it's given as an explanation for why the training of teachers remains at the non-university level in Argentina, and why they're not going to change that. And so if you wanted to change that, first you would have to have a government that isn't so focused on winning low-skilled people's votes by giving them teaching jobs. You would have to have an important level of dialogue with the teacher unions to say, and with the teachers, not just the unions, but with the teachers, and what are you going to get in return for us increasing the selectivity of the teaching profession and so on. These are tough questions, and it's much tougher to have these questions and to solve them when you are outside of East Asia. So
Consider the U.S.
Yeah, so the U.S., but that doesn't mean that it's not possible. So consider the U.S., where access to teaching is quite low, but compare the U.S. to Canada, which is also democratic, but has much higher standards for becoming a teacher. And so I think that one thing that would be really, really helpful moving forward is to invest a lot more attention into democratic countries, what gets you to adopt policies that are the policies that we want, these types of policies. But there are democratic countries that have done this, Finland for sure, but not just Finland. And so understanding the politics of reform and trying to move away a little bit from the typical, oh, we can't do it if there are strong unions, because that's also not true. Finland has one of the strongest unions, right? So we need to understand a lot more what's the political logic that's gonna allow countries to identify opportunities and allow the bank to identify opportunities within countries where the right conditions are in place to push for these reforms.
Could Jaime tell us about Peru?
That would be great. Yeah.
I was going to say, we have a minister who's been on the bleeding edge of these confrontations.
Let me be more politically correct and not talk about Peru, but give an example that that is far from Finland or from a Nordic country that democratically has chosen the right path. No, let me go to a municipality in Ceará, in the northeast of Brazil, called
It was going to
Sobral.
be Brazil, right?
Yeah,
Good.
which called Sobral, right? Brazil is a very, very decentralized system, so a lot of responsibilities are at the state level and at the municipality level. Now, it happens to be that Sobral, good thing that Brazil measures well learning, and so they knew about 15 years ago, they were ranked in the 1300th position of the municipalities in Brazil. 15 years later, they're number one in the municipalities in Brazil. And still, Ceará is still a poor northeast state. Sobral is a relatively poor municipality. So what was the change? And talking to the mayor of Sobral, he's a politician there, he said the key political decision that we took 15 years ago was to take politics out of education, right? And what that meant in concrete fashion was, to start with, is that principals of schools were selected in a political way.
Yeah.
Right? So who was the principal of the school? Well, someone from the party, someone who has supported the mayor, etc. Okay, so they changed that, and they had a meritocratic process of selection of principals, right? And a meritocratic selection also of people who would work in the administration of the system. Okay, that's a huge start, and that's really taking politics out of education. You see many countries, many countries in the Middle East, right, in which the selection of principals and bureaucrats in the education system is highly politicized, highly politicized, right? Hence, you cannot be able to focus on learning in the way that Sobral was able to do. So I just want to put that example because it's one example in which it is possible, right? It is possible to take politics out of the education system. Right? I'm not saying that it's easy, right? It is possible. Now, in many countries, the truth is that through different mechanisms, you need to have political alignment, because, as you were saying, for many issues we kind of know what to do, right? In the sense of, say, how does a good primary school looks like, or how a decent primary classroom and what the teacher has to do. We kind of know what the technology is, right? I mean, it's not perfect, but we kind of know what to do, right? In other areas, probably we are not there, right? But in that area, we kind of know what is a decent primary school classroom. So the challenge is not on the policy design. So we kind of know what to do. The challenge is on two things. One is the political alignment, right? So, for instance, in the case of teachers, you need to make sure that your teacher's career is structured in a way that might be, it's fine that it's a social mobility instrument, as long as it has as a main focus learning of kids. That has to be the main focus, right? If in addition to that, you make it a social mobility instrument, okay, fine. Okay, but so there has to be a political alignment, right, in terms of what is our objective. And third is that you need to have implementation capacity. Because, okay, I know what's the technology in terms of the right classroom in primary. I have the political alignment. But look, I don't need to implement these in one classroom, nor in 10 classrooms. I need to implement this in 100,000 classrooms, depending on the size of the country. Right? If I go back to Peru, to my country, okay, fine. I mean, when we were implementing the full day of secondary, so expanding the secondary day from half a shift to a full shift, we kind of knew the technology. Okay, this is the way this school should look like. Small detail, we need to do that in 8,000 schools, right? Because, as someone was saying, progressive universalism is absolutely critical. I don't care about being able to do that full day of secondary in 100 schools. I don't care, right? I care about making sure that eventually we're going to reach the 8,000 schools in Peru, right? It will not be done in 1 year. It might take 8 years to do that, or 10 years, and that's fine, okay? It's because logistically it's impossible to change things from one day to the other. But you need the three things. You need to have the design, you need to know the technology, what you want to do, you need to have that political alignment, it's critical, and you need to have that implementation capacity. And with that third point, I go back again to the human factor. I would say you need the right teachers, you need the right principals, but you also need the right bureaucrats. And when you talk about implementation capacity, you're talking not about having the right pedagogues or the right teacher, the right experts on education. No. It's not only that. You need to have the right people, the right public policy managers, right, in order to be able to implement that progressive universalism, right? That is a scaling problem or challenge, right, that is very tough. So it's always going, for me, and education is in general a human-intensive endeavor, right, at all levels.
You want to jump
I
in,
just
Nancy?
want to sort of extract 2 points from what Jaime said, telling a little bit of a story, because he brought me back to when I was in the World Bank in the late 80s working on education. And the World Bank had had 2 huge loans in Northeast Brazil, which were going nowhere. And on my first visit as a new division chief in a new sector, we went to towns and small villages, and those were the places where, when the party changed, the house where the schooling occurred switched from one party to another party. The teacher became whomever, as you said. So, but what are the lessons? Because I followed, what happened in Brazil with education for some time afterwards, including at the Inter-American Development Bank. The first thing that happened is they had a reforming minister at the top level who pushed and eventually got assessment, which is one of the points that's very important in this East Asia report. And it took a long time, but there were already a lot of people in Brazil who had done assessment at different levels in different places. So I think one of the lessons there is that created the competition that you referred to, even for this municipality of Sobrão. The second thing is that the competition sort of came earlier at the political level, because some states, including Ceará, even in the late 80s, came governors who were sort of modernizers. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking of, for those of you who might know Brazil, Ciro Gomes at that time, who later, I believe, ran for president and didn't win. And so that would have been in the late 80s. And I guess the point there is he introduced changes in his state that then put his state a little bit ahead, I believe, when this national universal assessment happened. So that, it comes to the point you were making at the end, Jaime. It takes time to infiltrate a big system and different inputs. But in the end, I see that assessment as critical in creating a kind of healthy competition. Things like that could happen all over Africa, if you think of Nigeria or Ghana. And then having the luck, sometimes if you don't have the luck of post-war situation, you have the luck of some reformers show up. And Jaime himself is an example of that when you became minister in Peru.
All right, I'm going to drag us back to, this is what we get for having the composition of experts we have here. I'm going to drag us back to East Asia, though, and push us,
Too much Brazil.
push Jaime a little bit on. We couldn't have Sri Mulyani here, but I'm going to ask an Indonesia question in her absence. And I want to push you on maybe some of the more controversial and politically incorrect parts of the report, if I read between the lines. The bank commissioned this large-scale RCT of the increase in teacher salaries in Indonesia, and it produced this World Bank paper, which is widely known, Double for Nothing. The doubling teacher salaries generated no increase in learning, and the report references that because the doubling of teacher salaries didn't come with kind of the necessary concomitant reforms in terms of accountability and incentives you would have wanted. I think you can come at this from both the politics or the finances angle. If this can be done with democratic politics, why wasn't it? There was a big push. Why did it fail? Why did a giant teacher reform policy get rolled out that the experts kind of thought was maybe doomed to fail? And pushing you further on the banks, so the report comes pretty close to saying money and teacher salaries don't matter, right? There's no correlation between spending and student performance. And
it says that.
It says that, right? It doesn't come close. It kind of says that. So the question is, is that bank party line? Where do you come down? Do we money doesn't matter? The doubling of teacher pay was a mistake.
Yeah, I have a very clear answer for that. Money does matter, right? But just having the money doesn't imply that you're going to use that money well, right? Now, if you don't have money, there's very little that you can do, right? So, I mean, it's a necessary, right, but not sufficient condition, right? So you need to, so look, in the case of Indonesia I think is clear, right? You need to pay teachers better. Yes, of course you need to make to pay teachers better, because what you want, and money is just one part of the equation. You want to have a teacher's profession that has social prestige, right? I think that's the key point, right, of the systems that work with respect to the systems that do not work, right? So the teacher profession has prestige. And for that to happen, yes, I mean, you need money, that's important, but it's not only money, right? It's, for instance, it's having those filters, right? Is that, oh, it's tough to get into university to study education. It's tough to get into in those institutions. And it's tough to get a job, right? Such that when if someone says to his or her parents, I'm going to be a teacher, I mean, their answer should be, wow, that's great. You really, really want to do it? Because it's very tough to be a teacher, right? That should be the answer. If that's the answer, then it's a system that is working. Which requires money? Yes, requires money. But it's not only money, right? It's all these mechanisms that make that profession a profession in which, I mean, you will have to struggle, you will have to work hard, but you will have opportunities to make progress. For that to happen, yes, you need resources, but Indonesia is a good example. Resources are not enough, right? Now, on the other hand, if one looks at the big picture of how much countries are spending on education, I would say, like, if you're spending more than $4,000 per student per year, then the discussion between spending 4,000, 6,000, 10,000, that's a rich country problem, right? And most likely, I mean, you could be more efficient, but that's a rich country discussion, right? If you go below the 400, and then you compare what can I do with $200 per pupil, right, versus what can I do with $2,000 per pupil, then clearly the answer is, look, I mean, there's no way, right, a Uganda or a Kenya, right, or any other sub-Saharan African country that's spending $200 per pupil will be able to make it without more money. Just saying, okay, let's be more efficient. There's no way. I mean, then that would mean that all European countries are a bunch of idiots that are spending $7,000 when you can do it with 200, just being a little bit more efficient, right? No, no way. It's impossible, right? You need to expand secondary, you need to expand early child education, you need to make sure that buildings have a decent infrastructure, and that costs money. And you cannot do that with $200 per student. There's no way. It's not magic, right? Now, when you are in 4,000, okay, then you can discuss, well, maybe there's not that great correlation, right? And you always will find examples of countries who are doing marvelous things, I mean, with little resources. But overall, I think the answer is money is important. You need resources, but that will not guarantee better learning, because it all depends on how you use those resources.
Great. All right, I'm going to open it up. I want the panelists to stay here, but I'm going to open it up to questions from the floor. I'm going to actually suggest that, Harry, why don't you come up and take I'm going to stand up and help field questions, but some of these are inevitably going to be directed at Harry. Like I said, you'd have another shot at him as well.
Justin, can I push back on something?
Please. Yeah, while you warm up your questions,
Yeah.
and there are people walking around with mics, so have your questions ready, and Augustina's going to pick a fight.
First, I'm so glad we're sitting next to each other, because I agree with you on almost everything you're saying, and it's great to be with you on the panel. However, exactly, I'm going the American way. Well, I want to challenge this idea that you actually can take politics out of education. And I want to challenge the idea that East Asian countries have taken politics out of education, which is something that the report says. And the reason why I want to challenge that is that East Asian countries, in addition to promoting a lot of learning of the types of skills we want students to learn, they also use education to indoctrinate students. And there's very good evidence of that published in the Journal of Political Economy last year. So, indoctrinate. Yeah. That those reforms have been quite effective. So curriculum reforms in China, in the case of the JPE article I'm referencing, have been very effective in leading students to become much more supportive of autocratic institutions, subservient to the current regime, and so on and so forth. And so the idea that these countries have taken politics out of education, I think that's completely false. But even the idea that you could do that, the decision to, as you were saying in this Brazilian municipality, the decision to change the mechanisms by which you assign teachers, promote teachers, and so on, that is a political decision. And so there's no way you can avoid politics. You just need, I think the crucial question is, when do the political incentives align with the bank's incentives of promoting learning? And that's a question we still don't have an answer for because we're not studying it.
Okay, so can I just on that? So we agree, because I haven't said that. East Asian countries. What is that East Asian countries are doing the politics? I was quoting the mayor of Sobral, right? And he said we have taken politics out of education. Now, but remember this exact statement that I made is, he said our political decision was to take politics out of education. And actually, what he's saying is taking politics out of the classroom, right? So make the decisions in terms of how the system works, how the process of learning works. That cannot be politically driven. That has to be technically driven, right? I want to choose you as the teacher here because you're good at teaching, not because you belong to that party. So that part, yes, you need to take politics out. But just to do that, right, that is a political process. To be able to have a system that does that, right, is a political process, right? And I completely agree with you. Once you go outside the classroom or outside the school, yes, it is a political process, because even this issue of progressive universalization, right? Given that things take time, right? If you want to make a change, you want to improve early childhood education, okay, but you need to reach all kids. So that will take, even with the best implementation capacity that you have, if you have all the resources in the world, it will take you several years. Hence, it will take you several governments, right? Hence, you need to have a political agreement, right, that should happen. Now, has that happened only in autocratic systems? No. There are democratic systems that have taken that decision, okay, let's continue investing in education over and over and over, right? And that happens. You see that in many, not only education. So a good example is the cash transfer program in Mexico, right? Which what happens is that it changes name from one government to the other. So I lost track now. It's Oportunidades, Progresa, and there's a different name now. Prospera. Okay, fine. Okay, change. Exactly. Fine. Look, change the name. That's okay. No problem. But if you keep the principle and then you continue doing something that could be adjusted a long time because things change. Also, needs of the countries change. That's fine. But it ended up being a state policy, not a government policy. So, is it easy? No, it is tough, right? And given that it's tough, that's why we have a learning crisis. If it would be easy, then, all countries will be learning. Precisely the fact that political process is so hard is the reason why we do have a learning crisis, and is the reason why even countries that have the resources, right, are not being able to get their kids to school and make them learn. And in some cases, that countries also, they don't get their act together in terms of putting the right resources, right? But it is a political challenge that we have.
Okay, I see a number of hands. Okay, let's start here, and then we'll go to the gentleman. Let's take a group of three. So the woman here in the beige coat, the gentleman in the suit here, and then the woman on the front row here. We'll come around to another round.
So thank you so much for this report. It's been incredibly informative, and I can imagine a lot of people being able to use it in so many different ways. For me, as someone who typically looks at the work of schooling through an organizational science lens, what is particularly of interest to me and what I'd love to see more unpacked is this issue of how they're using the time in the school. So in a lot of World Bank reports, we've seen Stallings look at the use of teacher time in the classroom. But I really want to learn more about this issue of teachers spending 18 hours a week teaching and 53 hours a week in the school. That means for a given day, if we were to unpack the use of teacher time, regardless of how much education they've had before they come into the school, there is this focus on continuous improvement cycle from the Warren Deming perspective, in which a little more than 3 hours a day is spent teaching, and a little more than 7 hours a day is spent on the work of refining the craft. What I most want to learn from East Asia is what they are doing inside that time with each other as professionals to refine their craft. Ben Jansen did a good job of kind of highlighting that in the and the work on professional development that NCEE did. And you've done another good job of kind of highlighting that. And yet, I am not seeing that work unpacked. And it's kind of repositioned this old narrative of classroom teaching as the black box, whereas I want to know what East Asian countries are doing that has become the new black box.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the Center for Global Development for this interesting talk discussion. My name is Freddy Rojas. I'm from with Rutgers University. My question is more related to policy and this idea of level the field in education terms. So especially when some country reach another income status, either, for example, lower income to upper level income, or just joining another club. For example, I'm from Peru, and sooner or later, Peru is going to join the OECD. So OECD with tough labor markets, with it's a new challenge. What is the best policy for countries like Peru when they are going to join another challenge? Taking into account, for example, Chile. Chile is in the OECD group with a high inequality. What is the best policy for this? If you can juxtapose Chile and Peru. Peru is about to join OECD maybe in 2 years, and Chile is in this group already with a high inequality. Thank you. Thank you for your answer in advance.
Yang No Yoon, Foundation for Empowerment. I cannot agree with you more that the money is not everything. Money is not even necessary condition, perhaps. And the prestige of the teacher is so important. But first of all, as an economist, I'd like to ask you, who is an economist, that school education seems to be discussed in learning, in terms of particular learning, seems to be discussed so much in school context. If we think about the economics, you know, I am the product of the East Asian education in the 1960s. And it's the same thing in China, same thing in Vietnam. What is the biggest, strongest drive for learning from the consumers, myself as a student, and the parents? It is meritocracy. They understand the meritocracy, and they understand the private rate of return is so high. Now we all, World Bank, multilateral development, and CGD is talking about the public rate of return. But strongest drive for education is the private rate of return. So that's my question. So I'd like to ask you how you did learn from the East Asia about meritocracy. Not other things can be very corrupt, but meritocracy. And what kind of the repercussion it has on getting job, which kind of job, what? I'd like to ask you. Then I have one answer to your question. Yes, no, like I, as a East Asian, I went to school actually with a triple shift, and one class, one shift was 120 students. Because I was growing up slum area in Seoul, peri-urban area without water, without running water, with a very, very frequent blackout and all these things. So I went to school there, 120 students and a 20-year-old teacher who just got a 2 years education education training. At the end of the day, I'm one of 6. I went to college in Korea, and I went to Harvard, thanks to Harvard's generosity. So I got an MPP, and I got a PhD in agricultural economics at Cornell University. This is the story of the East Asian education. My mother did have only primary school education. What school teachers did? They could teach only 2.5 hours a day. Then, what she did, to me at least, she gave a lot of homework. So we had to do homework at home. And then what she did in the extra time, she scored. Then what is right, what's wrong, and we had to do it again. Next day, we bring up again. This is one of the ways. So, and then one more comment I have to say, I cannot disagree with you on efficient use of money in poor countries. In poor countries, they have to use money more efficiently for education. So I did work on the East Africa education and other things in 1991. And I tried to actually, organize things for East Africa to learn lessons from Korea. If Korea can do it, Ethiopia and Kenya can do it. And so what I actually prepared as a report is that when you look at it, in 1961, Korea used 2% of the GDP per capita on education. Kenya used 10% of GDP per education. Where did they use the money? 80% of the education budget went to the tertiary education. 0.1% of the entire cohort went to the tertiary education. How did Korea use the money? And 70% went to primary school, and the 20% went to the secondary school. 10% went to the tertiary school, but 15% of the cohort went to the tertiary education. Idea was very simple. Once you go to the university, then you will get good jobs. So you pay for it. What did parents did? These very poor parents did that they sold. They were all farmers. They sold their only one cow. Without cow, you cannot have the rice farming. They sold. So within the call, we call the tertiary education university, not ivory tower. We said that the cow hunt, ox hunt tower, that's the tiers of their parents who sold. And those who went to university, usually first son, had to be a cows for the entire household. So the thing is that here, I just want to show that this is an East Asia story.
Thank you. There. Okay, so I'm going to give the panel a chance to, people can jump in. We've got the black box of what goes on in the classroom. We have what policies do we need to join the OECD? What are the challenges facing Peru versus Chile? And then, there are a number of pieces in this last question and comment, but I'm curious, to hear this idea that it's the private rate of return and the meritocratic labor market that's driving demand. Can other countries replicate and learn from that? Harry, you want to jump in on that last one?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for the Korean story in summary, and I think it is very much the Korean story that we've looked at as well. I wanted to second the point about the benefits of education and how this motivates. And I think this is a good example of where families' investments and their focus on learning outcomes. And I think that it is true, this system of educational success leading to selection to institutions, then access to jobs. I think it very much drives it. And I wanted to relate that also to the question on time use in the classroom. I think we're seeing this black box open up very much. Thanks for that question. And I think the East Asia story is very instructive here. Some of the top systems are actually countries where there are fewer hours devoted to the actual teaching and a lot more to the preparation. And I would mention two examples: the Shanghai model of the teacher cohorts working together to perfect lessons, learn from each other, and bring it back to the classroom so that the hours they have in the classroom are actually very productive. The other example would be Japan's early reform programs, the lesson plan, and the more recent reforms to bring that sharing among the teachers together. I would say China and Japan probably have the curriculum frameworks adopted that are closer to 21st century demand for skills than I've seen anywhere else. The focus on fundamentals along with social participation, collaboration as part of their core framework elements. And I think this is where they're going to take the discussion to a much higher level, preparing people not only to do the basics well, but also to be prepared for this very fast-changing nature of work. Last fact on the returns to education, they are going up. They're going up for higher education and not very equitably. Very high dispersion, very high returns. Those skills that people need are in short supply. Education systems are not keeping up. I think East Asian economies are gearing for that revolution in education that's quickly coming.
Jaime, do you want to tell us anything about what Peru has to do when they join the OECD?
Let me, before that, let me complement what Harry was saying on the issue of private returns. I think that is a driving force. That is important, but and it's fine that, in particular in tertiary education, right, families will be willing to finance higher education, but still the huge challenge is to making sure that you have a system that provides quality education in a homogeneous way, right? Particularly in tertiary education, yes, returns are going up. I don't know exact numbers, but could be around 80 or 90% of the increase in the supply of higher education is private, right? And that new private education comes in very, very different shapes and forms and different qualities, right? And you have very high quality higher education and also very low quality higher education. You could even have scams, right? That the people are just paying and getting nothing, right? And others are paying and getting a lot, right? So still there's a critical role that will be for the society as a whole and for the state to make sure that that supply is of, not necessarily all will be of excellent quality, but of decent quality, right? So I mean, that is something that should worry us in terms of that private investment, right? And those investments of families, both in terms of money and in terms of time of students, have to be coupled with a supply, right, that it's, I mean, decently and appropriately regulated. That's one point.
Sorted out by the market enterprises, so we can know that who are the good ones, who are the better. So their assessment comes. They are actually municipal education and others have the role to play. The assessment of the learning quality and what is that, and that's a very important function of the education system.
Exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, based on that, market hires those with the qualities, and the education system really informs people that these are not good enough. Please don't invest in this scam.
Exactly.
Education.
Can I jump in? In a lot of countries, the market doesn't actually work that way in terms of rewarding skills and merit. In a lot of countries, access to jobs is a lot more determined by your social network and whether you have connections to jobs.
This
And
is
so
exactly what I'm talking about. That's why meritocracy
exactly.
is very
And I think,
important.
right, but in East Asia, you have a very long history and culture of meritocracy and valuing meritocracy
It was
through.
not always the case. We evaluated, we created actually in the 1960s and 70s through reform. Please don't think that the Confucianism is most important, but that was not everything. Reinterpretation of the Confucianism and the prestige of the teacher. In Africa, there was amazing prestige for the teacher. No, Nyerere, when he died last year, he said he wants to be called Malimo to the end of the day. Malimo means teacher. That prestige has gone down. This is the problem, how to interpret the tradition, what you had, how to take advantage of it, how to get rid of it.
So,
Okay,
Justin?
yeah, please.
If you want to jump in, I want to get to the Peru question so we can
No,
open it
no,
back
no,
up
but
again.
that's
before-
fine. Jump in.
Please,
Oh,
Nancy.
Yes, I'll try to be short. I think this discussion about what happened in Korea is actually very fundamental in terms of the overall success in many East Asian countries. I've learned a lot sitting at this panel, particularly from my two fellow panelists. But what I wanted to say is how important, the report does say focus, primary and secondary. The politics of that are extremely difficult. And I find myself asking the question, has it been the right approach that the World Bank has pushed for many years now in Africa, where the universities, because, it's a mess. They're not good. They're really not good. So I think there's a bigger question for the next World Bank report about what to do in that situation. The lesson from Korea has definitely been high private returns because of high growth. That's connected to the points that Harry made, very impressive about 1.1 trillion or 10 trillion, all that. We can't escape that reality. So if education is going to contribute to growth, then it may require some rethinking of some policies. I do think that the magic in Korea was that so much money went into primary and secondary, and that generated private demand for good quality, privately provided tertiary education. So it was well, maybe I'm wrong about that detail, but the point is that in Latin America and in Africa, the whole business has has contributed to inequality because the better off students go to better secondary schools, then they get into the public universities, which are nicely funded, at least until recently maybe, but you can't get in unless you've gone to a good secondary school. So it's a vicious cycle. So this is a really big issue of how you turn high private returns in the short run into something that works for everyone in terms of equity and progressive universalism. That's a big lesson maybe from East Asia.
Sorry, we're going to need to open it up.
You can
Sorry.
learn about the one is that about the successful university in Ghana. So one who used to work for Microsoft went back to the Ghana, Accra. He established a private
Yes,
university.
very good.
That is what Africa should learn from him. No, you know what he
Okay,
said?
we need to open it up to
He
other
said
people as
that
well.
What is the problem in the education system in Accra? He said that entitlement. Sense of the entitlement by students is a problem. That is one of the deep problems in Africa. Sense of the entitlement.
Now
Okay.
I want to.
You want to answer that first, then we'll open
Right,
it back
so,
up. Yep.
so two things. One is that linear progression that we have observed in East Asia, it might be that it will be difficult to say, okay, so let's start the clock again. Now let's go to other South Asian or Latin American or African countries. Let's start all over again as if nothing has happened in the past, and let's do the East Asian way now, okay? That's not possible, right? Because you are where you are today, right? So, so today the challenge for many low-income and middle-income countries is probably much more complicated because it's going to be very difficult today to say, okay, so let's focus on early childhood development and in primary education. Let's put all resources there. Also because Jim Heckman has said that the returns are much higher there, right? So, okay, sorry, people who are today in universities or in university age or, I mean, too bad, sorry, okay. The other thing that we said again, okay, born again, we'll take care of you whenever you are reincarnated. But now, sorry, we're not going to invest in you.
Yep.
It's very difficult. It's very difficult.
Politics.
Right? Because of the politics. But not only because of the politics, it's also because these people who today are 15, 20, 30-year-old have gone through a very low-quality system. A year's already passed, but they're going to be in the labor market the next 50 years.
Yeah.
Right? So you cannot say, okay, I don't care about them. You will have to care about them. So the pressure that we have in the system is now even larger. Even larger. So that's one complication, right? So I'm not answering the question of prioritization here, right? Obviously, right? I'm very bad at that, and in this case. But I'm just saying there is a huge pressure there, right? In many middle-income countries and low-income countries, of large cohorts of young people who have passed through a very low-quality system and will be in the labor market for a long time. And many cases, though, those people do not have the fundamentals. Right, those basic skills of the reading and writing that report says, okay, if you don't know how to read, nothing else will be able to achieve, right?
We can't even train you after.
Exactly. So, but we need to solve that issue. So we do have an adult learning problem that is huge and that we need to recognize.
All right.
That is very big. Okay.
On that note, I left somebody pending in the back. There's still a question here. Gentleman in the purple tie? Yes. And... Yep, Suzanne. Is that Suzanne Lee? Yeah. Okay. Hi, Suzanne. Suzanne, first. Well, you've got the mic. Suzanne first, and then we'll come over here.
A quick question. Maybe this is for Harry. And knowing that in East Asia, each country is different, the role of the private sector, going on with the private rate of returns, and in South Korea, they made some strategic moves at the secondary level when they didn't have the budget envelope to do it, so they kind of privatized it. If you could speak to a little bit from your looking at the East Asia experience, what was the role of the private sector, at what level, and what was strategic about it?
Yes, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Muhammad Al-Arif. I'm Special Advisor to the Minister of Finance of Indonesia. She sends her regards and regret. She wants to be here, but sends a delegation instead and asks to report back. Thank you for the report, Harry. And I think, the East Asian education miracle is an important story. Although not all countries are created equal in this case. Indonesia is fixated about the Vietnam success. When Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand are doing better than us, we're fine. But when Vietnam is doing better with us, we get worried, right? So what is there from the Vietnam experience that we need to capture, that they've done, that we haven't done? Secondly, they're extremely centralized system. We are extremely decentralized. The education function is held by 400 plus local government and so on. Is there merit to having more centralized system in this case? Thank you.
Okay, I am going to have to be hard-nosed and watch the timekeeper on the front row and probably stop there to let our panel come back on. Again, everybody wants to find out how we bottle up Vietnam and export it. So the Indonesians now are officially asking. And this issue, which is, it's a huge issue in education that we haven't really touched on, about centralization and decentralization. I'm curious to hear the response on that. And really, I think Harry possibly planted the question from Suzanne about the private sector. But so anyone on the panel, let's start with you, Harry, and if anybody else wants to jump in on those before we wrap up.
Yeah, thank you. And I would again go to the case of Korea on the strategic use of the private sector. As you said, their version of the progressive universalism didn't mean we only do primary schooling. It meant the bulk of public resources would go there, but the reach of government was at all levels of schooling. And I think two innovations deserve merit. One is the way they used the secondary school, the high school private high schools. And in order to assure people about not getting into the entanglement that Jaime meant about the low quality, having public funds go with the private high schools and having a sort of lottery to assign students to those schools prevented the elite capture or cream skimming that often is associated with private expansion. So I think that was a pragmatic approach, but very much a responsible government approach, and I think it's best practice on using public funds for private schooling. And I think it's an example that gets glossed over, but there's actually a literature on this that's worth looking at. I think it's very much related to the high school equalization policy, which I know some Koreans would like to see changed, and there was some effort in the last administration, if I'm not mistaken, but it's still there. But I think it's a fundamental interest in being pragmatic, focusing on basics, while not limiting opportunities. The other innovation, and it's something that the bank was involved in partially, was Korea, when Korea was borrowing from the bank, the first education sector loan was in Korea. It was funds that went from the government to private colleges, upper secondary, post-secondary colleges, in order to continue to provide the skills for industrialization while the government focused public resources on basic and secondary education. I think it's another innovation that very few countries have followed. I think this program, the college on-lending program, would be an innovation if a country did it today, some 38 years after. We welcome the opportunity to bring the Vietnam experience to Indonesia. In fact, one of the things that Vietnam would like to learn more about is the role of subnational, sub-sovereign participation in education. They're very much looking at how they can both continue the policies that work well, but also to empower other jurisdictions to get more involved. So they would like this learning experience. Also on the management of a large higher education system. They are focused on reforming their higher education system to bring it to global standards. And I think many of the policies that have worked at the basic education level would be worth sharing with Indonesia. So happy to try to broker that, because I know there's interest on both sides about exchanging information and learning. Thank you.
All right, we are officially over time, unless anyone wants to fight for a last word. I want to thank all of the panelists, thank all of you for being here, and congratulations to the team on a great report.